Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today we're focusing on what might be the fastest, most dizzying investment rush in the history of Silicon Valley. The pot of gold, of course, is artificial intelligence.
It really is. I mean, this is the most high-stakes speculative frenzy we've seen in years. And we're not just talking about, stock prices here. The stakes are, well, they're huge. We're talking about the future of tech, of our economy, maybe even civilization itself.
But there's a big but here, isn't there? A lot of heavy hitters. I'm talking about everyone from OpenAI's Sam Altman to the Bank of England are saying this whole thing looks like a bubble.
They are. And it's hard to disagree, so we figured, let's just skip the question of if it will burst.
Right, because that seems almost like a given at this point. Our mission today is to dive into the really critical question: what happens after? What will the fallout actually look like?
Exactly. What kind of wreckage will it leave?
Yeah.
And just as importantly, will anything of lasting value come out of it?
Yeah.
And to figure that out, I think we have to start with the original American speculative frenzy.
The California Gold Rush.
The California Gold Rush. It is the perfect, repeatable analogy for what we're seeing today with AI.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The gold rush, 1848 to 1855, the scale of it was it's breathtaking. Something like 300,000 people just dropped everything and flocked to California.
All of them chasing this dream of getting rich overnight. It was a global thing. And the impact was enormous. It basically made California a state. It set up these global trade networks. But the human cost was also immense.
Yeah, tragically, it led to the brutal displacement and massacre of indigenous people whose lands were just completely overrun.
It did. But for our purposes today, the core economic lesson, the one that maps directly onto tech right now, is about who actually got wealthy.
And it wasn't the prospectors, the so-called 49ers.
No, not really. Very few of them ever struck it rich. The real lasting fortunes were made by the people selling the shovels, the tools needed for the dream.
For merchants.
The merchants. You have this massive irrational surge in demand for something, and the safest bet is to service that demand, not to go digging yourself. So the winners sold food, supplies, and, hardware.
Which brings us to probably the most famous example of this, Levi Strauss.
Right, the jeans guy. But he didn't even start with jeans, did he? He was a Bavarian immigrant, came to San Francisco thinking he'd sell dry goods, maybe some canvas for tents.
But he noticed a problem.
A huge problem. The clothes the miners were wearing were just falling apart. They couldn't stand up to the work. So he pivoted. He took that durable canvas and started making these incredibly tough denim overalls.
He was selling the uniform of the gold miner.
Exactly.
Yep.
A constant essential good. He became maybe the most successful and remembered figure of that whole era, not because he found gold, but because he sold the shovels and the jeans.
Okay, so let's apply that template. And today's AI gold rush, who is the modern Levi Strauss, it has to be...
Oh, it's got to be Nvidia, absolutely. I mean, their stock price surge is just staggering, and it's all built on this dream of artificial general intelligence.
But the key difference is they're selling something tangible right now.
That's the point. Unlike, say, OpenAI or Anthropic, whose valuations are based on achieving that dream someday, Nvidia is selling the hardware, the chips, the GPUs. They're selling the shovels and the jeans for this digital gold rush.
And their business model is just fundamentally safer. They get paid whether or not the AI startups ever actually find AGI.
They profit from the effort. And this pattern is so powerful because it's not new at all. We can trace this all the way back to, the 17th century Dutch tulip mania.
Where a single tulip bulb could cost more than a house.
Or the South Sea bubble in 18th century Britain. That was pure hype about trade that never even materialized. It crashed so hard, Parliament actually had to step in and pass something called the Bubble Act to stop it from happening again.
So every new frontier seems to spark this kind of reckless speculation.
Always. AI is just the latest version of a very, very old story.
Which sets us up perfectly for the central puzzle we're trying to solve today. The big challenge is figuring out what kind of bubble AI is. Is it the kind that will ravage the economy or the kind that leaves something valuable behind?
And this is where it really matters for you, the listener, because we have two very different, very recent models for this.
Let's start with the nightmare scenario, the devastating bubble. We're talking about the 2008 housing crisis.
Right. That bubble wasn't just about house prices going up. It was built on a mountain of debt. It was all about mortgage finance, giving loans to people who couldn't pay them back. So when it crashed, it almost took the entire global financial system with it.
And the legacy was what? Systemic damage.
Systemic financial damage. You had banks, households, everyone with these toxic assets on their balance sheets. Financing completely froze. And that gave us this long, painful recession because the actual plumbing of the financial world was broken.
Okay, so that's one model. What's the other?
The transformative bubble. Think of the dot-com crash in the late 90s.
Pets.com, Webvan, all these companies with crazy valuations that just evaporated.
It completely collapsed.
Yeah.
But the recession that followed was, comparatively shallow. And the reason is fascinating. The hype was irrational, for sure, but the money was being poured into something real. Fiber optic cables, server farms, all this new infrastructure.
So even though Pets.com failed,
The infrastructure it helped fund ended up being the foundation for companies like Google and Amazon to build on. It gifted the world the modern internet.
so the key difference is the lasting value left behind versus the amount of financial damage caused by debt.
And we really need to quantify that risk. Geeta Gopinath, who was the chief economist at the IMF, she actually ran the numbers on this. She calculated what a crash equivalent to the dot-com implosion would look like today.
And we should probably brace ourselves here. What did she find?
A stock market crash of that size today would erase roughly $20 trillion in American household wealth and another $15 trillion abroad.
20 trillion. That's nearly the size of the entire U.S. GDP. That level of wealth destruction,
Yeah.
it would absolutely crush consumer spending and trigger a very, very serious recession.
No question.
So whether we get the dot-com bounce back or the 2008 collapse really comes down to one thing. How is this AI boom being financed? Is it cash or is it debt?
That is the trillion-dollar question.
That-
Literally. If this whole thing were just being funded by the giant cash piles that big tech, Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft have sitting around, the system would be pretty safe.
The tech giants would take a huge hit, but the banks would be okay.
Right. But if they're borrowing heavily, then the risk shifts. It's not just a corporate loss anymore, it becomes a systemic vulnerability. It starts to look a lot more like the housing crisis.
And the data we have suggests that borrowing is, well, it's surging.
That's the really worrying trend. The scale of this AI arms race is so huge that even big tech's cash isn't enough. They're turning to debt.
I saw a Bloomberg analysis on this. It said big tech has raised nearly $250 billion in debt just this year.
And that's a record for them. A record. It's essential because the spending required is just astronomical. Morgan Stanley analysts think the industry needs something like $1.5 trillion in total funding to build out all the data centers and hardware.
That's a massive gap to fill, and they're filling it with debt.
More and more. And there's another problem that makes this even worse, the opacity. It's getting really hard to track who is funding whom.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you have all these companies in the ecosystem, Nvidia, OpenAI, the cloud providers, all buying into each other. They're swapping equity for cloud credits, taking on these complex debt structures. The lines get really blurry.
So it's hard to tell who's actually on the hook if things go south.
Exactly. It creates this tangled web of financial obligation. It makes it almost impossible to know who, in the end, will be left holding the bag when the music stops.
But isn't that sort of standard practice in Silicon Valley, this kind of cross-investment?
To an extent, yes. But the scale is what's different now. The risk isn't just the amount of debt, but how interconnected it is. In 2008, the crash got so bad because of opaque things like CDOs. When the housing market tanked, nobody knew who was exposed to the bad debt.
And you're seeing a similar risk profile here.
A very similar risk profile. This opacity in AI funding, combined with these trillion-dollar investment goals, it creates the perfect conditions for a domino effect.
Okay, so the financing structure is definitely flashing some warning signs, a lot of warning signs. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the enduring value. Will the actual AI tech being built right now even survive a crash?
I mean, does the technology justify this level of euphoria? That's the other huge question. For these valuations to make any sense, the tech needs to be on a path to something truly world-changing, something like AGI.
Artificial general intelligence, machines that can do any intellectual task a human can.
Right, the holy grail. But here's the thing. There is deep, serious skepticism about the current path, and it's coming from inside the tech world itself.
Not just from outside critics.
No, from the very top. We really need to look at the critique from Yann LeCun. He's a Turing Award winner, was Meta's chief AI scientist for a long time. And he basically believes that this massive investment in large language models, LLMs, the tech behind things like ChatGPT, is fundamentally misguided.
What's his argument? If they're not a path to real intelligence, what are they?
He calls them essentially massive correlation engines. They are incredibly good at predicting the next word in a sentence because they have analyzed statistical patterns from basically the entire internet.
But they don't actually understand anything.
Exactly. They lack what even a toddler has, a genuine mental model of the world. They don't get physics or cause and effect. They just know what words tend to follow other words.
So if all they do is correlate, then the path to AGI, the whole justification for this frenzy, is blocked?
That's his argument. He says you can't get to AGI just by making LLMs bigger and bigger. He thinks the industry needs to completely switch to what he calls a world model architecture.
A world model, what does that mean in simple terms?
Think about how a baby learns. They drop a ball and it falls. They learn about gravity. They build an internal predictive model of how the world works. He's saying machines need to do that. They need to develop a genuine mental model of reality, not just a model of how humans talk about reality.
So if LeCun is right, what does that mean for the trillions of dollars being poured into LLMs right now?
It means the current spending is, to put it mildly, a big oops.
Hmm.
It's not that LLMs are worthless. They're great for summarizing an email or writing a bit of code.
But they're not worth trillions of dollars.
Not if the goal is AGI, which is what's justifying these valuations. It would prove, once again, that just because you sold a ton of shovels and jeans doesn't mean there was ever any gold in those hills to begin with.
That's a critical distinction. The tech might be useful, like the early internet infrastructure, but if it can't deliver on the grand promise of AGI, the valuation bubble has to pop.
That's the perfect way to put it. There might be some enduring value, but not the promised superhuman value that's fueling this massive debt cycle.
Okay, so let's try to recap the two big takeaways for you, the listener. First, the risk of a really bad recession is high because of this massive reliance on debt, which pushes the whole situation closer to the 2008 housing crisis model.
And second, the actual value of what's being built is being seriously questioned by some of the smartest people in the field who think the core technology is a dead end for achieving AGI.
So you have massive financial risk on one side and massive technological risk on the other.
It's a dangerous combination. And if you zoom out, history just screams that this is how these things play out. There's a famous study by economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. They looked at 66 major economies between 1945 and 2007.
Yeah.
They found that only 4 of them had managed to avoid a major banking crisis in that whole period.
Only 4 out of 66.
Just 4. Portugal, Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But here's the kicker. By the end of 2008, none of those 66 economies were left unscathed. Speculative bubbles and banking crises are the norm, not the exception, when a new frontier opens up.
The AI rush is just following the historical script.
Precisely.
Which leaves a final, really important thought for you to consider. If we know that almost every new investment frontier leads to a speculative bubble, then the question isn't if the AI surge will pop. It's what will it leave behind when it does.
Will we get the robust, world-changing infrastructure of the internet? Or will we be left cleaning up the systemic financial wreckage of 2008? How this debt crisis unfolds will give us the answer.